At night in the Jerusalem neighborhood near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is not prayers that are heard most loudly, but moans, coughs, and the creaking of wooden beds. A damp wind blows between the long buildings of the Hospital of St. John, carrying with it the smells of sweat, vinegar, rancid lamp oil, and pus from poorly healing wounds. In one wing lie adult men with bandaged heads, feet blackened by gangrene, and stomachs torn apart by dysentery. In another, adult women whose bodies belong simultaneously to disease, pilgrimage, and foreign control. Through the thin walls at night, you can hear footsteps, the rustle of clothes, the muffled voices of brothers on their rounds. This is enough for a short-lived rumor to spread throughout the city, that night visits are taking place in the hospital, that the hospital is a convenient screen for debauchery under the guise of charity. Greetings to everyone listening to this analysis. Write in the comments which city and country you are watching this video from, and what you have heard about the Hospitallers, as merciful monks, military knights, or allegedly dissolute hospital owners. I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience, because we will be talking about how the actual statutes of the Jerusalem Hospital, duty rosters, and disciplinary records break the familiar myth of the hospital cover and reveal a harsher, more prosaic picture of control over the body and reputation. To move beyond legends, we need to imagine a specific place. The Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem in the 12th century was not an abstract house of mercy, but a dense complex next to the city's main shrine. Several buildings, courtyards, warehouses, kitchens, and staff quarters. Inside, there were long halls with rows of beds or simple wooden platforms on which adult pilgrims and townspeople lay. Sources describe a division by gender. Men's wards were separate from women's, in separate buildings or wings, with their own servants and elders. Not only the brothers of the order worked there, but also hired women who wash clothes, bathe bodies, and carry heavy chamber pots at night. This combination of a male monastic order and women's quarters in itself creates tension between the vow of chastity and the inevitable physical intimacy. The Order of St. John built its reputation on caring for the sick and poor. Papal letters established it as a community directly subordinate to Rome, with the right to accept donations and manage the hospital and its lands. But behind the pious formulas lies a strict internal structure. The statutes that gradually formed around the Jerusalem hospital set out a clear order: who sleeps where, who distributes food, who has the right to enter a particular ward. Monks are reminded that communication with women is a source of risk to their vows. They prescribe at what times and for what reasons a brother may enter the women's ward, with whom he may be accompanied, and under what lighting conditions. Violations are punishable not only by penance, but also by specific disciplinary measures: deprivation of food, restriction of movement, and in severe cases, expulsion. The medicine of the Crusader East does not allow for purity to be maintained from a distance. Adults are brought to the hospital with open fractures, festering wounds after battles, fevers that no one can explain, bloody diarrhea, and old ulcers that have long since turned into holes in the tissue and skin. Treatment remains within the limits of contemporary knowledge: bloodletting, laxatives and emetics, hot poultices, ointments based on honey, wine, fat, and resins, and sometimes cauterization with red-hot iron. The pain was relentless. The only pain relief was wine, intoxicating herbs, and exhaustion from days of fever. In the women's ward, complications after childbirth, exhaustion from travel and hunger, and inflammation from dirty laundry were added to this. The hospital was the only place where such patients were not thrown out into the courtyard or left at the doorstep of a church. Against this backdrop, stories about night visits are born. It is not difficult to imagine the combination in the city: wards where adult women do not get out of bed, brothers who are required to make night rounds, checking breathing and wounds. The dim light of lamps, whispers. This is enough for the order's detractors, rival monastic communities, secular barons, and some of the local clergy, to revive the old story that the hospital is just a cover. It is convenient to say that under the guise of charity, they buy the gratitude of pilgrims, bequests without heirs, and access to the bodies of those who are unable to object. Rumors of nighttime footsteps in the women's wing add to the general distrust of all military and religious orders. Too rich, too autonomous, too close to the shrine. But inside the hospital, these risks are treated as a technical problem. The statutory logic requires the separation of premises, schedules, and responsibilities. The women's wards are physically separated from the men's. Only designated maids and a limited number of brothers on duty according to the schedule have access to them. Their names are entered into lists, shifts are marked, night rounds are recorded. Any unnecessary presence of a man in the women's wing formally becomes a violation for which he can be questioned. The order is trying to turn the space, which is the subject of legends, into an area with the most transparent rules possible. Not because it is humane by modern standards, but because discipline is the only way to protect both its reputation and its patients in conditions of cramped quarters, poverty, and constant suspicion. The myth can only be dispelled where it clashes with a specific case. In one of the stories that allow us to reconstruct the order's practices and the logic of its disciplinary norms, rumors of night visits turn into an official complaint against a secular benefactor of the hospital. An adult man who generously donates money for beds and linen is given the right to come to the hospital and see how his gifts are being used. As he spends more and more time in the women's ward, his attention to individual patients becomes too noticeable. One of the women complains, not publicly, but through a chain of trust, and the complaint reaches those responsible for the charter and internal discipline. The order is faced with a choice: turn a blind eye for the sake of money, or apply the charter against a man whose name is already inscribed in prayers of gratitude. The decision in favor of the charter triggers the next, quieter conflict. The loss of a generous patron hits the medical workshop, the supplies of medicine and food, and the salaries of secular specialists. Tension arises within the hospital between those who believe that the order has paid too high a price for its principles, and those who see this as the only way to prove that the hospital is not a front. In response, the disciplinary machine takes the next step. Duty rosters and ward admissions become even more detailed. Complaints become more formalized, and control over night rounds becomes stricter. Thus, between the rumors of a cover-up hospital and the dry lines of the statute, a space begins to grow where the document attempts to maintain at least minimal protection for sick women, even when pressured by money, status, and political interests. Inside the hospital, the tightening of control is felt not as an abstract fight against myths, but as a change in everyday habits. The night rounds are no longer just a walk around the ward, but a line in the register. The name of the person on duty, the time, the building, the number of beds checked, a note about any incidents. The senior nurse in the women's ward is now responsible not only with her body and voice, but also with her handwriting. She must confirm time and again that there were no strangers in the wards at night. Any exception, a doctor with a seriously ill patient, an urgent call, or the admission of a layperson, must be recorded. The space, which used to be filled only with footsteps and whispers, is now overgrown with columns and numbers. The story of a wealthy benefactor who was accustomed to lingering in the women's wing becomes the point where abstract rules are transformed into concrete action. The complaint of an adult patient, conveyed through a maid and a supervisor, does not dissolve in conversation. The clerk reduces it to a dry statement, and a commission of senior brothers and a doctor compares the words with the duty roster and visit records. It turns out that this layman's nighttime appearances strangely coincide with the shifts when the youngest or most dependent brothers are on duty. For some, this is enough to see abuse. For others, it is a reason to remind them of his donations and shelves with linen and ointments bought with his money. The decision is made at a council meeting, where a list of gifts and a brief summary of the complaint lie nearby. Some of the brothers suggest limiting themselves to a warning, but the majority fear not only sin, but scandal. There are already enough people in the city who consider the hospital a cover for luxury and hidden debauchery. If the story of the benefactor, who was allowed to visit the women's wards at night, comes to light, the accusations of hypocrisy against the order will become too convincing. The council chooses the harsh option. First, it restricts the layman's access. Then it completely forbids him from visiting, leaving him only the right to donate without being present. Formally, this is a victory of the charter over the wallet, but in reality, it is a risky break with the man who fed the hospital. The financial blow is quickly felt. Expensive ingredients appear less often in the medical workshop, ointments are diluted more than necessary, and linen sheets are replaced with coarse fabric. Adult patients are still accepted, but treating them becomes more difficult and cheaper. Secular doctors and barbers, dependent on their salaries, openly grumble. The decision of their elder brothers means another shift among emaciated bodies without enough medicine and clean linen. Those who voted for harshness at the council meeting are now forced to justify not only morality, but also the consequences. To explain that discipline is worth the losses, and to hope that the reputation of a strict hospital will bring new patrons. In response, the order makes its control even more visible. Night duty rosters are posted at the entrances to the wings so that maids, brothers, and even some patients can see who is responsible for the corridor, for distributing food, for changing linen. Complaints are transformed from whispers into a procedure. They are recorded in a special notebook or placed in a chest, the key to which is kept by the hospital administrator. Illiterate adult patients are helped to formulate their complaints without mentioning names unnecessarily, but recording the essence, rudeness, malnutrition, disorder in the ward, suspicious presence. On certain days, the chest is opened in front of several brothers, and the complaints are sorted: domestic, disciplinary, related to access to wards. The new mechanism works both ways. Patients and junior staff are given a week, but still an opportunity to turn their fear and anger into a record that must be read. Doctors and some of the brothers use the same channel to record pressure from above. Attempts by patrons to enter the ward without the nurse on duty, instructions not to blow up individual incidents, demands to speed up the discharge of convenient people. Thus, rumors of night visits are gradually being transformed from an elusive whisper into a field of controlled discipline, where each story can theoretically be followed by an investigation and punishment. Outside, this does not dispel the myth. Opponents of the order continue to say that any lists are just a smokescreen, that real abuses will never make it into the books. For them, every duty roster is further proof of hypocrisy. But inside the hospital, the charter and the paper begin to perform at least a minimal protective function. For an adult woman lying in a hospital ward, what matters most is not the formulas in papal letters, but the sober knowledge that the name of the person on duty is posted in the hallway, that a complaint can become a line in a book, and that a benefactor who behaves dangerously has already been removed once. In a world where the bodies of the poor and sick do not usually belong to them, even such cold, bureaucratic protection becomes a rare form of resistance to the usual order. It quickly becomes clear to the order's leadership that the paper armor of the charter is only half the battle. The other half begins where the hospital is seen as a hub of money and influence. Around Jerusalem, a class of people is growing up who live between war and trade. Grain suppliers, ship owners, knights who are more often in the rear than on the front lines. For them, donating to the hospital is not only charity, but also an investment in their reputation. When rumors reach them that one of the major benefactors has been effectively ousted from the hospital because of suspicious visits to the women's wards, some of the elite conclude that the order is dangerously independent, capable of placing abstract statutes above convenient connections. The first blow is felt not by the treasury, but by the medical workshop. Some merchants and knights transfer their gifts to other shelters and monastery hospitals, where decisions are made by a single abbot rather than a council with protocols. The hospital's supplies of medicine dwindle faster than usual. Linen sheets are replaced with coarse cloth, and ointments are diluted more heavily. Adult patients still have their bandages changed and are brought bowls of soup. But between these actions, naked economy increasingly comes to the fore. Secular doctors and barbers, dependent on their salaries, see how they are being turned into an extreme buffer. Pressure from above, from the sick below, and from patrons on the side who want special treatment for their people. Within the order, this has led to a new dispute. Some brothers insist that doctors should become an extension of the charter, recording pressure from benefactors, refusing to violate the regime, using the complaint mechanism, even if it threatens to lose money. Others, responsible for contacts with laypeople, believe that such a doctor himself becomes a threat. If another major donor leaves because of his harshness, it will be necessary to choose between principle and the survival of the hospital. At one of the meetings, this conflict is turned into text. A clause is added to the disciplinary rules, stating that no layperson may interfere in the running of the wards or the allocation of treatment, regardless of the amount of donations. This is not an act of humanism, but an attempt to maintain centralized control. If every patron receives a piece of power within the hospital, neither the duty rosters nor the complaint box will work. To ensure that the new clause does not remain a dead letter, the order makes the rules even more visible. Duty rosters and responsibilities are posted at the entrances to the wings, with a separate line noting that lay people are not allowed to enter the wards without being accompanied by an appointed brother. Doctors are now able to refer not only to the Latin Charter, but also to the crude inscription on the wall. The complaint box, which initially collected mainly complaints about food, rudeness, and unwashed sheets, is gradually filling up with reports of attempts to exert pressure. Unexpected night visits by people not on the lists, demands to let someone in without the person on duty, requests to not record certain incidents. The same books in which duty shifts are recorded now become a tool for defending the rules themselves. The myth of the cover hospital remains intact. Opponents of the order are still convinced that any lists are just a smokescreen, and that real abuses will never make it into the books. But inside the hospital, the charter begins to work, at least partially. Any attempt to appropriate a patient's body, whether by a wealthy layman or an influential brother, is thwarted by the fact that this body is assigned a bed, a ration, a nurse on duty, and the possibility of complaint. For adult women in the wards, all this is still weak protection. What remains decisive is not the text of the statute, but who actually enters the ward at night. But now, at least they have a name on the list at the door, and a channel through which the episode can become a recorded fact rather than an eternal whisper. In a world where the bodies of the poor and sick usually dissolve into an anonymous mass, even such a cold, bureaucratic framework becomes a rare tool of resistance to the usual order, where money and status pave the way to someone else's bed without hindrance. The death of one adult patient made the rumors about the hospital louder than any sermon. The woman, who was connected to a local nightly house, was brought to the hospital with a severe fever and swollen joints, hoping for the best care from the order. She was returned with her body wrapped up. Traces of bed sores, traces of endless bandages, traces of an illness that no one could reverse. Her relatives saw only the result and quickly pieced it together with the town's stories of nighttime footsteps and greedy monks. They said that she was poorly fed, that her relatives were not allowed to visit her, that she was not protected from intrusive attention. The legend of the cover-up hospital was given a convenient face and surname. The complaint went not only to the shops, but also to the chancellery. The patriarch's people and the king's advisors demanded a report. Who was on duty the night before her death? Which lay people visited the wards? What complaints came from the women's wing? The hospital staff brought out the duty logs, doctor's notes on poultices, bloodletting and useless medicines, and the complaint box. There were complaints about pain, rudeness, and lack of sleep, but not about night visits. Instead, an old record surfaced about the very benefactor whom the order had already removed from the wards. This story was brought up as evidence. Once, in order to protect the patients, an influential person had already been pushed out the door. The inspectors did not limit themselves to paperwork. They walked through the corridors, looked into the wards, and questioned the staff and survivors. They spoke of the cold, the meager food, and the pain of the procedures, but confirmed that the wards were separate and that nighttime access was only allowed on duty, recalling how the brothers refused lay people who tried to enter without permission. In the reports, this resulted in a compromise. They acknowledged the harsh conditions and the need for greater control, but did not record systematic laxity. The order was instructed to bring some of its discipline outside. Copies of duty rosters and summaries of complaints now had to be sent regularly to the patriarchal office. For the hospital, this resulted in a new layer of pressure. Any refusal to relatives or admission of a patron could now end up not only in the internal notebook, but also in the hands of strangers. Some brothers began to adhere even more strictly to the charter, preferring to detain relatives at the door rather than risk a violation. Others used external reporting as a shield, reminding everyone that any deviation would be seen at the top. The myth was divided again. Some claimed that the order had only learned to better mask evil under reports, while others referred to the audit as proof of purity. Between them lay reality: overcrowded wards, emaciated adult bodies, crude medicine, and rare cases when a stranger's wallet really did rest against the sign at the entrance and the lock on the complaint box, rather than passing freely to the women's bed. The publicity, which the order had been so reluctant to accept under the pressure of the audit, eventually became part of its everyday face. At the entrance to the hospital, not only were lists of benefactors and patrons posted, but also neatly rewritten duty rosters. Who was responsible for the men's wards, who for the women's, who for the night rounds, who for distributing food. These sheets were updated, rewritten, and protected from dampness, as one would protect a sacred object. For a pilgrim or townsperson entering these arches for the first time, the hospital now greeted them not only with the smell of ointments and sour soup, but also with rows of names. The order showed that behind every corridor, behind every door, there was a specific person who could be held accountable if something went wrong. The complaint box also ceased to be a strictly internal secret. It began to be mentioned aloud in sermons and at meetings reminiscent of almsgiving. It was said that patients could report rudeness, lack of sleep, and violations of order to their superiors, that complaints were investigated, and that the guilty were punished. For the order, this rhetoric was a way of demonstrating control over its own weaknesses. For patients and junior staff, it was a rare hint that their suffering could be recorded rather than disappearing into thin air. In practice, not every complaint led to change, but the very habit of turning pain into text slowly changed the structure of fear. Alongside the horror of illness came the experience of appealing to the rules. Over time, a layer of such texts accumulated in the hospital archives. Duty rosters, summaries of complaints, records of punishments, reports to the patriarchal chancellery. Some sheets recorded the deprivation of rations for a brother who fell asleep on his rounds. Others recorded a remark to a doctor for being too lenient with a patron. And in others, a layman was denied a night visit to the ward, confirmed by 2 names. Among these papers, there were occasional references to the long-ago story that marked the beginning of the turning point. The case of a patient's complaint about her benefactor's night visits, and the order's decision to remove him from the wards despite the loss to the treasury. Within the community, this became an example that was referred to when it was necessary to explain why a rich man was denied an exemption from the rules. Meanwhile, the myths surrounding the Hospitallers continued to live on and mutate. In some stories, the order was still portrayed as a closed world where luxury and arbitrariness were hidden under the guise of charity. In others, as a harsh machine that turned people into neatly arranged bodies under gray blankets. But those who saw inside the walls of the main hospital knew a third side, the endless work of people bound not only by vows, but also by schedules, lists, and reports. These records contained no generous legends of miracles. There were notes about shifts, deaths, punishments, and rare occasions when a patron's wallet did indeed stop in front of the sign at the entrance to the women's wards. For an adult woman who found herself on one of these beds, the result of all the reforms looked extremely concrete. Her bed was not ruled by a myth of holiness or someone's whim, but by a combination of illness, poverty, and regulations. She knew that the name of the person on duty was posted in the hallway, and that a maid could whisper a request to have her complaint written down in a book. She knew that once, a wealthy man had been denied access to the wards because of behavior that was considered threatening. None of this took away the pain, the risk of dying in a foreign country, or guaranteed absolute safety. But it gave her a faint, almost paper-thin feeling that her body was not completely up for sale in this system. In the long run, it was precisely such quiet decisions that determined the real history of the order. Not loud legends about knights and battles, not vivid accusations of debauchery and cruelty, but the choices of people sitting over lists and chests, to remove a patron or yield to him, to record a complaint or hide it, to hang a sign with duty rosters on the door, or leave everything to chance. The Hospitallers lived in a world where pain and poverty were the norm, where the authorities could oppress any community with impunity. But in their main house, they built a layer of protection, consisting not of legends, but of statutes, schedules, and complaints that had to be taken into account at least occasionally. Therefore, the myth of the hospital cover in this place inevitably collided with the document. The disciplinary register, in which modesty and access to bodies were not a gift, but the result of a stubborn, imperfect, but nevertheless existing struggle for the rule against noisy rumors.